I was on my back porch that Friday morning, a mug of black coffee warming my hands when the phone rang. The weather was crisp, the kind of early autumn air that made the garden smell faintly of pine and old wood. I wasn't expecting anyone to call this early. At 72, my mornings were sacred. Coffee, paper, silence. But when I glanced at the screen, my son's name glared back at me. "Dad," he began without so much as a hello, his voice brisk, as if he were already halfway through the conversation in his head. "About the cruise next month, we've hit a snag." I knew that tone. It was the "I need something but I don't want to say it out loud" tone. I set my mug down and leaned back in my chair. "What kind of snag?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just enough to make me suspicious. It's the payments. We're short. The suite for Emily and the kids, it's more than I thought. I figured you could cover the difference." There it was, the real reason for the call. "How much is the difference?" I said. $8,000 just for the upgrade. It'll be worth it. Emily's parents are coming, and I cut him off. $8,000 for an upgrade? I already paid for my ticket, and for yours. There was a pause on the line, the kind where you can almost hear the other person's jaw tightening. "Dad, it's family. We want to make it special." I exhaled slowly. I'd been through this before, the subtle guilt trips, the casual assumption that my savings were their safety net. It was a pattern I'd ignored for too long. "I'll tell you what," I said. "I'll help cover part of it, but only if the money ensures that my granddaughter has her own space. I'm not paying for extras to impress Emily's parents." His tone cooled instantly. "Fine, whatever." I knew whatever meant this conversation isn't over. When I ended the call, I sat there for a while watching the light shift across the porch floor. I loved my son. I always would. But the older I got, the more I realized love didn't mean saying yes to every unreasonable ask. Some boundaries had to be drawn, even if it made you the bad guy in someone else's story. Little did I know in less than 2 weeks I'd be drawn into a much darker version of that lesson, one that wouldn't just involve money, but trust, safety, and my own survival. And it would all start with a voice I trusted more than anyone's. The day we boarded the ocean horizon, the sky was clear and the wind was mild. Cruise staff in crisp white uniforms greeted us at the gangway. My granddaughter, Chloe, clutched my hand with excitement. She was 10, curious about everything, and had that habit of asking questions you couldn't brush off. The ship was magnificent. Glass railings, polished decks, the faint scent of salt water mingling with perfume from the first-class lounge. Families bustled around, pulling suitcases, scanning keycards. I'd been on cruises before, but something about this one felt different. Not in a good way. The smiles from my son and his wife were too polished, their voices pitched a little higher than normal, like they were performing. By the second evening, that unease would have a voice. A small, urgent voice, whispering words that would stop me cold. It was just after sunset. We'd had dinner, and Chloe and I were standing by the railing, watching the lights from the shore fade into darkness. She tugged on my sleeve, her eyes wide. "Grandpa," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "leave the liner. Now." I laughed softly, thinking she was joking. "What are you talking about?" Her face was deadly serious. "I heard them. Dad and Mom. They said something bad was going to happen to you tonight." The wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face, but her gaze never wavered. And in that instant, I knew this cruise wasn't the family vacation I'd been promised. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. The clink of glasses from the bar behind us, the shuffle of deck chairs, the low thrum of the ship's engines, maybe I'd just filled in the blanks wrong. But Chloe's grip on my sleeve tightened. "I'm not kidding, Grandpa," she said in a low, urgent voice. "They were talking in the cabin. I went to get my book, and they didn't hear me at first. Mom said, it'll look like an accident if it happens on the deck." Her eyes darted toward the aft section of the ship. "And Dad said, we just have to make sure he's alone." The words punched the air right out of my chest. I crouched slightly so we were eye level. "Chloe, listen to me, you're sure you heard that?" Word for word, she nodded so fast her hair bounced. "I'm sure, they didn't see me. I ran out before they could." I wanted to tell her she misunderstood. That maybe they were talking about someone else, or it was some twisted joke. But deep down, something in my gut told me she was telling the truth. I'd been sensing distance from my son for a while. Not just the usual father-son disagreements, but a kind of cold calculation when money came up. I'd ignored it, chalked it up to stress. Now ignoring it wasn't an option. "Okay," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Here's what we're going to do. You don't tell anyone else about this. Not your parents, not a crew member. Not yet. Just stay with me, always when we're outside the cabin." Her small fingers squeezed mine. "Promise you won't go near the deck alone?" "I promise." But promises were funny things. Sometimes you made them knowing you might have to break them for the right reason. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying her words. "It'll look like an accident. What kind of accident happens on a cruise ship?" Too many answers came to mind, and none of them good. Around 2 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and stepped onto our small balcony. The ocean was a black expanse, the moonlight fractured by the waves. Somewhere music was still playing faintly, a late-night lounge act for passengers who didn't want to sleep. I thought about knocking on the captain's door right then, but without proof, what could I say? My 10-year-old heard her parents plotting something. At best, I'd be humored. At worst, dismissed. No, I needed something concrete. The next morning, I had a plan. After breakfast, while the family split up for different activities, I went ashore with Chloe for the port excursion. The moment we stepped into the market, I ducked into an electronics shop and bought a small digital recorder. It was voice-activated, barely larger than a thumb drive. When we returned, I hid it in the main cabin, tucked between the cushions of the chair where they liked to sit and talk privately. If Chloe was right, they wouldn't be able to help themselves. And this time, I'd have their voices captured. By mid-afternoon, the ship was moving again. The sun was hot on the deck, the air heavy with salt and sunscreen. Chloe and I played cards in the lounge, while her parents were resting. Every so often she'd glance toward the cabin section, her mouth tightening. She didn't say it, but I knew she was thinking about what might be happening in that room right now. And I was thinking about the recorder, quietly waiting to hear what kind of people my son and his wife had really become. That night would give me my answer. And once I had it, there'd be no going back. The ship moved smooth and silent over dark water that night. Most passengers were at the theater watching a comedy show. Chloe was asleep in the twin bed beside mine, curled into a little ball, clutching the stuffed dolphin she'd picked up at the gift shop earlier that day. But I wasn't watching the waves or listening to the ship's music anymore. I was watching the time. It was just after 11 p.m. when I quietly stepped into the hall and walked to the cabin where my son and his wife were staying. My hands didn't shake, but my jaw was tight. I slipped into their room using the second card key I'd asked the front desk for earlier, claiming I needed to leave them a surprise birthday gift. The attendant hadn't questioned me. White hair earns more trust than it should. The recorder was still there, neatly tucked where I'd hidden it. LED light blinking faintly. I picked it up, pressed play, and heard nothing at first. Just the hum of the AC, then the creak of the bed, and then their voices. "Emily, he's got no one else. When he's gone, the house is ours. The accounts are already joint. My son, we don't even have to do anything direct. The deck's slick. He leans too far, he slips. It's over." Emily laughs softly. "And Chloe, she'll forget. She's a kid. We'll say it was an accident. My son, he's stubborn. We just need the right moment." I stopped the recording. I sat down on the bed and stared at the wall. The air felt thick, like it had weight. These weren't just cruel words. This wasn't exaggeration. This was premeditated. And it wasn't coming from strangers or criminals. It was coming from my son, the boy I'd raised, coached in baseball, helped through college, and the woman I once welcomed into my home like a daughter. I wanted to march straight to their room, confront them, let my rage pour out, but I didn't. I knew better. Anger wouldn't win this battle. Evidence would. Back in my room, I transferred the file to my phone and uploaded a backup to my cloud storage. I even emailed a copy to myself and titled it, "In Case I Disappear." Then I lay down in the dark beside my granddaughter and listened to her breathing. I realized in that moment, I wasn't scared for me. I was scared for her. What kind of people had she been born to? What kind of life would she grow into if they'd teach her love was something disposable, something worth sacrificing for money? No, this had to end. The next morning, I asked to speak privately with the ship's captain. He was a tall, calm man in his 50s with silver stripes on his shoulders and tired eyes. We met in his office, a small wood-paneled room filled with maps, safety manuals, and a faint smell of salt. "I have reason to believe there's a plot against me," I told him. "I have proof, Audio proof. He didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. "Show me," he said. I played him the recording. All of it. He listened without interrupting. Arms folded, eyes narrowing with each sentence. When it ended, he sat back and let out a slow breath. "You'll stay in our private quarters for the remainder of the trip," he said. "Your cabin will appear occupied, and we'll assign someone to your granddaughter without raising alarm." He paused. "They won't know anything has changed until we're ready." I nodded. "I want them off the ship. Quietly. I don't want this to become a scandal." He gave a grim smile. "We specialize in quiet resolutions, Mr. Grayson." And just like that, the tide shifted. Not because I fought, but because I prepared. Because sometimes justice doesn't need fists or shouting. Sometimes, it only needs truth, recorded, timed, and delivered when they least expect it. The captain's private quarters were tucked behind a locked-access hallway, far from the passenger decks. They weren't glamorous. No view, no polished mahogany, no fruit baskets, but they were secure. And right now, that mattered more than comfort. I stood by the porthole and watched the waves flicker under the early morning sun. The door clicked behind me. Chloe stepped in with the officer who had been assigned to shadow her. She looked confused but not frightened. "They said I could stay with you until we get back to shore," she said softly, dropping her small backpack on the floor. "Did I do something wrong?" I knelt beside her. "You did everything right." Meanwhile, the plan was in motion. The captain had instructed the ship's on-board security to discreetly flag my son and Emily's movements. Their keycards were silently restricted from certain areas, like the upper observation deck and lifeboat stations, without raising alarm. They had no idea the ship had turned into a floating net, and they were swimming toward its center. That afternoon, I sat with the head of ship security and reviewed the final details. "We'll confront them after dinner," the officer said. "The recording is more than enough, but we've also confirmed they tried to access the private deck late last night, the one you were previously seen frequenting." He slid a printed log across the table. "They were hoping for an opportunity. We're glad you didn't give them one." I nodded. My hands were steady. My heart, not so much. Because no matter how carefully you build the trap, it still hurts to catch your own blood. I spent the rest of the day quietly with Chloe in the captain's quarters. We played a board game. She beat me 3 times. We didn't talk about her parents. We didn't talk about what was coming. We just let the day be what it was, borrowed peace. But as evening crept in, and the sounds of the ship shifted from pool laughter to formal dining, I knew the hour had come. I didn't go with the security team. I didn't need to. They knew what to do, when to do it. I stayed by the window and stared at the moonlight dancing on the waves, trying not to imagine the conversation happening just a few decks below. I pictured the look on my son's face when he heard the recording played back. I imagined the denial, the disbelief, the rage. But none of it mattered, because this wasn't revenge. It was protection. By 9:45 p.m., it was done. A quiet knock on the captain's door. The officer stepped in and gave me a nod. "They've been escorted to holding quarters for the remainder of the voyage. They won't have access to any shared areas. Disembarkation will be arranged privately." I nodded once. "And the girl?" I asked. He looked at Chloe, who was busy drawing in her notebook. "She'll stay with you. We've cleared it." Later that night, when the ship fell still and even the waves seemed to hush, Chloe climbed into her cot and whispered, "Is it over now?" I didn't know how to answer. Was it over? The threat, yes. But the wound? That would stay for a while. Still, I smiled and kissed her forehead. "It's over for now. What do you say to a child who saved your life? There aren't words for that. You just hold their hand a little tighter and never let them feel forgotten again." The next morning, the sun came up like nothing had happened. Passengers filled the buffet line with sleepy eyes and flip-flops. Children laughed in the hallway as they ran toward the pool. A staff member played soft jazz in the atrium. For the rest of the ship, it was just another day in paradise. But for me, it was the morning after betrayal. I stood alone on the side deck, sipping coffee from a paper cup that tasted like cardboard. The wind tugged at my sleeves, and the ocean stretched out, endless and indifferent. Behind me, the people who once called me Dad were locked behind a quiet door under guard, trying to explain away the things they could no longer deny. There would be no shouting, no confrontation, Just silence and separation. Sometimes that's more permanent than any fight. I wasn't required to see them again. In fact, the captain recommended against it, but I asked for 5 minutes not to argue, not to accuse, just to look them in the eyes. The room was stark, a narrow bed, a bolted table, 2 chairs and a guard posted outside. My son sat slumped in one corner, eyes dark, jaw set. Emily stood, arms crossed, trying to look composed. Neither of them spoke when I walked in. I took a deep breath and said what I came to say. I raised you better than this, and if I didn't, that's on me. But Chloe doesn't deserve this version of you, and neither do I. He looked up then, face tight. You don't understand. I raised a hand. No, you don't get to explain. You planned it, together. And if not for your daughter, I'd be a headline, or a lost memory. Emily's mouth opened, but I didn't wait for her words. I turned to the guard and nodded. I'm done here. Chloe didn't ask where they were. Smart kids never ask questions they already know the answer to. Instead, that day she painted. A lot. She drew the ship. She drew the sunset. She drew a picture of the 2 of us sitting together, holding mugs of cocoa. And at the bottom, in shaky but determined handwriting, she wrote, "My safe place." The ship docked 3 days later. Security handled the disembarkation privately. No scenes, no drama. The cruise line offered to escort me through a separate exit. I declined. I walked off that ship with Chloe's hand in mine, not as a broken man, but as a grateful one. She looked up at me as we stepped onto dry land and asked, "What happens now?" I smiled softly. "Now, we go home." But home wouldn't be the same. Not because of what was lost, but because of what we found when it mattered most. Coming home felt quieter than I remembered. The house didn't feel emptier, just changed. The kind of change you feel after something sharp has passed through and left everything a little rearranged. Chloe stood in the middle of the living room, her backpack still on, staring at the wall where old family photos hung. She pointed to one. "Will we take this one down now?" It was a photo from 5 years ago. My son Emily and Chloe standing by the Christmas tree. I'd been the one holding the camera, so I wasn't in the frame, like usual. I stared at the photo and shook my head gently. No, let it stay. But they're not here anymore. That's okay. Let it remind us where we came from. Even the painful parts belong in the story. She didn't fully understand, but she nodded like she trusted I did. And that was enough. That week, I filed for emergency guardianship of Chloe. It wasn't a battle. In fact, her parents didn't contest it. Whether it was guilt or legal advice, I didn't know. Maybe they just knew they'd already lost. Child Services did a home visit. They asked the usual questions, checked the kitchen, walked through her bedroom, asked about her routines and schooling. And at the end of it, the woman in the navy blazer smiled and said, "She seems safe here, happier even." I didn't say it out loud, but the truth was, I was safer too. One evening, I was sorting old mail when I found an unopened envelope from 6 months ago. It was a holiday card from my son, one of those photo cards families send out to brag about their vacations and milestones. On the back was a handwritten line. "Thanks for the down payment help. Next year, maybe Alaska." I set it down, stared at it, then carefully tore it in half. Not out of anger, just finality. Chloe started drawing more. It became her outlet. Her way of understanding what had happened without having to speak it. One afternoon, I found her sketching the cruise ship from memory. But instead of the full liner, she'd drawn only the railing. One figure stood beside it. An older man, alone. "What's this one about?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "It's when you almost didn't come back." I sat beside her. "And what do you think stopped that?" She looked at me wide-eyed, then grinned. "Me." I nodded. "That's right." The more time passed, the more I realized I wasn't healing from a single event. I was healing from years of quietly accepting less love, less respect, less space in the very photos and memories I helped create. But not anymore. I was no longer invisible, because someone, a small someone with bright eyes and sharper ears, had pulled me back into the frame. I hadn't planned to touch the attic for another year. There was too much dust, too many memories stacked in cardboard. Decades of birthdays, retirements, and boxed up regrets. But Chloe had asked if there were old pictures of Grandma, and that was the kind of request I couldn't ignore. So one Saturday morning, we climbed the stairs with flashlights and gloves, kicking up particles of time with every step. The attic smelled of cedar and age. I pulled open an old chest labeled Evelyn, my late wife's name written in my handwriting, faded but familiar. Inside were albums, letters, and a worn brown folder I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was filled with negatives. Photography from Evelyn's early years, long before digital, long before life got complicated. Chloe sat cross-legged, flipping through the prints. She took these. I nodded. Your grandmother was the one with the eye. I just carried the tripod. She laughed, then held up one photo. It was of me, much younger, beard fuller, eyes sharper, holding Evelyn's hand on a camping trip. I want to hang this one in my room, she said. A simple line, but something about it landed deep. Later that night, after Chloe had gone to bed, I stayed up reviewing the old prints, faces of friends long gone, weddings we attended, a blurry shot of my son at age 9, asleep in the back seat of a station wagon. Back then, I had dreamed of a legacy, a family that stayed close, told the truth, showed up for each other. Now I was realizing legacy isn't what you pass down, it's what remains standing when others try to tear you down. The next morning I made a decision. I called the local community center and asked if they still had a gallery space. The receptionist, cheerful and surprised, said yes. They had a small rotating exhibit for local artists. I don't have art, I said, but I have truth, captured on film. She laughed, probably assuming I was being poetic. But I wasn't. I was planning to hang the photos Evelyn took of our family. Of me, especially the ones where I'd been invisible to others. Not because I wasn't there, but because someone else had chosen to crop me out. Now those pictures would have their own walls, and this time no one would be allowed to edit me out of the frame. When I told Chloe about the idea, her eyes lit up. Can I help pick the ones we show? I smiled. You'll be my co-curator. She grinned like I just handed her the keys to a kingdom. And maybe I had. Over the next 2 weeks we worked side by side, scanning old photos, writing little captions, restoring the ones with water damage. I taught her how to handle negatives. She taught me how to edit on an iPad. Every photo became a thread between who I'd been and who I refused to stop being. Not a shadow, not a wallet, not a burden, but someone worth remembering. The gallery wasn't much to look at from the outside. It sat between a consignment shop and an old diner that still used neon signs. But inside, the walls were freshly painted, the lighting was soft and intentional, and the space held a kind of dignity that didn't need polish to feel real. I stood at the entrance with Chloe, both of us watching as the first few guests trickled in. There were no red carpets, no orchestras, no speeches, just people walking in from the rain, curious, quiet, eyes shifting from frame to frame, image to image. And one by one they stopped, stared, then leaned in closer. There was a photo of Evelyn laughing, hand over her mouth, seated in our old backyard. One of me holding a fish that was clearly too small to brag about. A grainy black and white shot of my son at age 10 holding Chloe as a newborn. And finally, the centerpiece, a photograph Evelyn had taken just before she passed. I hadn't even remembered it existed until Chloe pulled it from the bottom of a folder. It showed me standing at the edge of a dock, hands in my pockets, staring out over the water, alone, still, not posing, just existing. And yet, it said everything. A woman in a green coat paused in front of that photo for a long time. She turned to me and said, "That's you, isn't it?" I nodded. She smiled softly. "You look like someone who's seen things, but held them quietly." Her words stayed with me longer than I expected, because she didn't know my name. Didn't know the story behind the photos. Didn't need to. She saw me. Really saw me. As the evening wore on, the room filled. Local artists, former neighbors, a few teachers, even the mayor stopped by for 10 minutes and asked if he could feature the gallery on the town's website. I laughed, told him it wasn't much, but he shook his head. Actually, it's the kind of much people need right now. Chloe wore a ribbon in her hair and stood beside the artist's statement we'd written together. It read, "Sometimes the people who frame the photos forget who helped build the house they're hanging in. These images are about memory, presence, and quiet courage. For everyone who's ever been cropped out of their own story, this is your space back." I glanced at Chloe as a small group clapped softly near the end of the wall. She looked proud, not just of the gallery, but of us. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a relic. I felt like a witness to the fact that truth, when framed correctly, doesn't need explanation. It just needs to be hung where everyone can see it. The email came in on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost deleted it thinking it was junk. The subject line was vague, for Dad, and the sender address was unfamiliar. An encrypted email service I didn't recognize, but something made me pause. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was that quiet corner of my heart that still wanted to believe people could change. I clicked it open. No greeting, no sign-off, just a wall of text. It was from my son. I know you probably won't read this, but if you do, I want to say something I never said aloud. I'm sorry, not just for what we did. That part, I'll never be able to explain or undo. I've tried. I've spent weeks thinking about the moment I said those words, the ones that were recorded. I don't recognize myself in that version, but I'm more sorry for all the years before that, the slow fade, the asking without thanking, the expectation that you'd always be there, quietly behind the curtain, picking up the slack. I don't expect forgiveness, but Chloe, she saved you. And maybe she saved me too, because now, for the first time, I'm actually seeing the man I called Dad, and I realize how invisible I made you. If you ever want to write back, you know where to find me. If not, I understand. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I was eager to forgive, but because I needed to be sure he'd written it himself, that it wasn't coached or prepared by a lawyer. It wasn't. I could feel his voice in the silence between the lines, and it hurt. Not in the way a knife cuts, but the way an old scar aches when the weather changes. I didn't write back. Not immediately. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who tried to erase you, then suddenly wants to remember? Still, I didn't delete it either. I archived it in a folder called Echoes. Maybe one day I'd be ready to reply. Maybe I wouldn't. But that decision would be mine. That night, Chloe and I made spaghetti for dinner. Her favorite. She grated the Parmesan with both hands and kept sneaking pieces into her mouth when she thought I wasn't looking. As we ate, she looked up and asked, "Do you think people can really change?" I set my fork down. "That's a big question." "But do you?" she insisted. I thought about my son's email, about the words I'd waited decades to hear, about the ones that still hadn't come. "Yes," I said finally, "but they have to want it more than they want to be forgiven." She nodded like that made sense, and maybe for a 10-year-old it did, because she'd already seen more truth than most adults ever do. The court date was quiet. No reporters, no cameras, just a modest courtroom in our county's juvenile division, the kind where the chairs creak and the judge looks like someone's retired uncle. Chloe sat beside me, her legs swinging slightly off the bench. Her backpack was filled with colored pencils, snacks, and a stuffed toy that never left her side. The judge flipped through a thin folder, glasses perched at the edge of his nose. "You understand the full responsibility, Mr. Grayson?" he asked. "I do. And you understand the guardianship remains permanent unless challenged by the biological parents in superior court?" "I understand." He looked at Chloe then, not as a legal figure but as a person. "And you? Do you want to live with your grandfather?" Chloe smiled softly. "He listens." That was all she said. That was all she needed to. When the gavel came down, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like the ground beneath our feet had finally stopped shifting. We walked out of the courthouse into a bright afternoon. No wind, no chaos, just the quiet hum of real life continuing. Chloe tugged on my sleeve. "Can we get pancakes?" I laughed. "Only if I can have extra butter." She grinned. "Deal." Later that week we redecorated her room. She picked a new comforter, sky blue with little constellations. I let her hang her art with colorful tape, even if it made the walls look like a preschool. She added one photo to her nightstand, not of her parents, not of friends, but of the two of us at the gallery opening, her in her ribbon, me in my corduroy jacket, both of us smiling like we hadn't been through hell and back. Sometimes survival looks like that, quiet, messy, beautiful in its own unfinished way. We created routines. Tuesday tacos, Friday puzzle night, Sunday library trips, nothing extraordinary. But that was the point. Consistency, safety, the kind of structure that kids remember not because it was flashy, but because it never broke. One evening while folding laundry, Chloe asked, "Do you ever miss them?" She didn't say their names. She didn't have to. I sat beside her on the floor, holding a small sweater she'd outgrown last winter. "Sometimes," I said, But mostly, I miss what I thought they were. She nodded. Me too. That's the thing about healing. It doesn't always come in big breakthroughs. Sometimes it comes in folded laundry and Tuesday tacos, in bedtime stories, in silent forgiveness you give yourself, in the absence of fear. It started with a school project. Chloe's class was doing a family history unit, one of those assignments where the kids bring in photos, create little posters with names and timelines, and share something about where they come from. She came home holding a blank template. I don't know what to put, she said. I could see the worry in her eyes. Not about grades, but about meaning. Do I put mom and dad? She asked. I thought for a moment, only if you want to. She was quiet for a while, then said, I want to tell my version. That was all I needed to hear. We spent the weekend going through albums, picking out pictures. One of her on my shoulders at the county fair. One of her holding a fish we'd caught in the lake. One of Evelyn, holding her as a baby. The only photo we had of the two of them together. She placed those in the center of the poster, framed them with glittery tape, and in bold blue marker wrote, My story starts here. On presentation day, the classroom was filled with parents. The walls were covered in crayon-drawn family trees and colorful paper borders. When it was Chloe's turn, she stood in front of her board, cleared her throat, and said, This is my family. My mom and dad made mistakes, so I live with my grandpa now. He teaches me how to cook, how to tell the truth, and how to take pictures of real life. I used to feel like I didn't have a place in the picture, but now, I do. She looked at me then, seated in the back row. I think pictures should show the whole truth, not just the shiny parts. I didn't know whether to smile or cry, so I did both. Afterward, her teacher approached me in the hallway. She's resilient, she said, and that comes from somewhere. I didn't respond, because I knew where it came from. It came from pain. It came from survival. And it came from the choice to love without conditions. That weekend, Chloe asked me for something I didn't expect. Can we take a new family photo? Just us, just now, just real. We set up the tripod in the backyard, waited for sunset, and stood together, not posed, not perfect, just present. The light was warm, the trees behind us were fading gold, and when the shutter clicked, something inside me settled. For the first time in decades, I was in the center of the frame. Not because I demanded it, but because I belonged there. It was a Sunday morning, the kind where the house smells like coffee and eggs, and the only thing planned is a long walk through the park. Chloe was at the kitchen table, braiding strands of yarn together to make bookmarks for her classmates. I was flipping through the newspaper, circling a few yard sales we might hit after breakfast. Then the doorbell rang. Not once, not impatiently, just a single chime that somehow sounded heavier than usual. I opened the door, and there he stood. My son. He looked thinner, older, not just in the face but in the way his shoulders curved, like someone carrying something that never quite lets go. He held a small envelope in his hands. No luggage, no coat, just him. And what I assumed was regret. Hi Dad. I didn't answer right away. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood in silence on the porch, surrounded by birdsong and early sunlight. Finally I said, Why are you here? I don't want anything, he said. Not money, not forgiveness. He held out the envelope. I just wanted to give you this, and maybe say something in person. I didn't take the envelope. Not yet, he swallowed hard. You don't owe me anything, and I know that now. I know I hurt you in ways I'll never fully understand. But Chloe, I hope she's okay. She's better than okay, I said. He nodded, eyes moist. I believe that. She always trusted you more than me. I hated that. Now I get why. The wind moved between us like an invisible wall. After a moment, I reached out and took the envelope. He looked relieved, not happy, just released. I'm going, he said. I won't come back unless she asks, or unless you say I can. I didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. He turned and walked down the steps, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. He didn't look back. I waited until that evening to open the envelope. Inside was a letter and a photo. The letter was brief. No pleading, no excuses, just a few sentences about childhood memories, and a single line that stuck with me. I wish I'd seen you the way she does. The photo, it was one I didn't remember ever taking. Me holding him as a baby, grinning like a man who had everything. Maybe once, I had. I showed it to Chloe. She stared at it a long time. Then she asked, will he come back? I was honest. Not unless you want him to. She nodded. Maybe someday, but not now. And that was enough. She didn't hate him. She just didn't need him yet. That night, I placed the photo in a drawer. Not on the wall, not in the trash, just somewhere in between. Because some chapters don't need to be erased. They just need to stay closed until they're ready to be read again. It was the annual storytelling assembly at Chloe's school. Every spring, the students took turns reading short essays or reflections they'd written in class. Usually light things, a favorite pet, a vacation, a silly moment with a friend. I hadn't expected Chloe to sign up. She was more of a sketchbook and notebook kid. Observant, thoughtful, but public speaking, never her favorite. Still, 2 days before the event, she brought home a folded piece of paper and said, "I'm reading this on Friday." I raised an eyebrow. "Can I hear it first?" She hesitated, then nodded. She sat at the edge of the couch and unfolded the page. Her voice was quiet, but steady. People think family means the people you look like, or the people you're born to. But sometimes family is the person who shows up when everyone else walks out. My grandfather didn't ask to be the one I live with now. But when things got hard, really hard, he didn't run. He didn't yell. He didn't pretend it wasn't happening. He listened. He stayed. He makes pancakes too thick. He uses way too much pepper on eggs, but he also leaves the porch light on every night, and he remembers how I like my blankets tucked in. He didn't save me with superpowers. He saved me by being the one person who never tried to be someone else. This is my thank you letter, not just to him, but to everyone who's ever chosen to love the quiet way. She looked up. I didn't realize I was already crying. I opened my arms, and she stepped into them, burying her face against my chest. "You're going to do great," I whispered. She nodded into my sweater. I know, the day of the assembly, the auditorium was packed. Parents with phones out, teachers trying to keep order, kids waving to friends in the crowd. When Chloe's name was called, I felt my chest tighten. But she walked up confidently, paper in hand, hair tied with a ribbon, the same one she wore at the gallery opening. She stood behind the podium, looked up, and read every word without hesitation. No stumbles, no nerves, just truth. The room was silent when she finished. Then came the applause. Not polite, not automatic, earned. Afterward, a teacher approached me. "She's got your heart," she said. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled, because she was wrong. Chloe didn't have my heart. She had her own. She just finally found the microphone to speak from it. It rained the following weekend, not a storm, just the kind of soft, constant drizzle that made the porch creak and the world smell like wet earth and memory. I sat in my rocking chair, a blanket over my knees, watching the drops thread down the railing like tiny rivers. Chloe was inside, building a blanket fort that would no doubt overtake the entire living room. A delivery van pulled up. A long, flat package leaned against the porch steps with my name scribbled in Sharpie. No return address. I brought it inside, cut the tape, and unwrapped the canvas. It was a framed version of Chloe's favorite photograph, the one from our backyard. Me in the middle, her beside me, both of us smiling without pretense. There was a note attached: "Everyone deserves to be in the picture. Love, Chloe." I sat down, the frame resting on my lap. For years I had been present in the lives of others, helpful, reliable, always on the edges. But now I was centered. That night, we hung the photo over the fireplace. We cleared off the old shelf clutter and gave it space to breathe. It wasn't just a picture, it was proof. Proof that when people try to crop you out, of families, of memories, of belonging, it only takes one person who sees you to put you back in. In the weeks that followed, the gallery invited me to do a second showing. This time the exhibit was called Framed Again. The People We Overlook. Visitors came from neighboring towns. A few even recognized Chloe from the newspaper write-up the local reporter had done. And one man, tall, silver-haired, soft-spoken, asked me a question that stayed with me. "What made you decide to share your story like this?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because for a while I thought my story had ended. But it hadn't. It just needed a better narrator. Life didn't become perfect after that, but it became true. Chloe grew. I grew too, in a different direction. Not older, just more rooted. And one day, when she asked if I'd ever sell the house, I smiled and said, "Not yet. It still has too many pictures left to hang." Because in the end, it wasn't the cruise that changed my life. Not the betrayal. Not even the letter. It was the moment I stopped waiting to be remembered and started anchoring myself where it mattered most. Right here, in the quiet, in the truth, in the center of my own story. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from?